Assassin's Creed Brotherhood was a terrible idea, and its creation has left a permanent mark on the franchise that it can basically never recover from. The whole creative idea of Assassin's Creed is exploring different eras of history, and yet in the third ever game in the series they decided to stick with the same setting and same character as the previous game. They broke the rules before the rules had even been properly established. They set the expectation that characters in the series would get multiple entries, which hasn't been true for a single character except for Ezio, and they permanently tied the identity of the brand to the Renaissance in a way that's incredibly damaging to their idea of making the series about history as a whole. In the process of making a yearly release schedule, they permanently dented the integrity of the brand and fan expectations of everything to come. So with all that said, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is one of my favourite games in the series and absolutely the best game in the Ezio trilogy. It's a game of rare creative cohesion where everything just comes together perfectly, like a Da Vinci painting, for one of the most consistent, fun, and, yes, cosy experiences in the entire series. I don't think we'll ever get a clearer example of success being your own worst enemy than Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is a weird game. It's not Assassin's Creed 3, but it's also a complete sequel to Assassin's Creed 2. It is the next entry in the story that's absolutely critical to understanding what's going on. It's not a spin-off, and yet it's not quite a full separate game either. It's more like Assassin's Creed 2 2. It's a sequel to Assassin's Creed 2, but not Assassin's Creed 3. This placement, more than anything else, is because of money. Ezio was popular. Very popular, and if you've got yourself a diamond, you probably want to make sure you make as much money as possible from it, right? And on the small scale, having a sequel continue on the story of the character from the previous game is the most normal thing in the world. Ezio's story at the end of Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't feel particularly final, so continuing his story feels pretty natural. It's only within the context of the Assassin's Creed franchise that sticking with Ezio starts to become a bad idea. A lot of people cannot get away from Ezio. He is Assassin's Creed to a lot of people, and it's their own fault for making 3 games about him, because it doesn't matter that some of the modern games are longer than the entire Ezio trilogy combined. We spent 3 years with this guy, following him from birth to death. When you do that, he becomes the face of the franchise. In that story, Brotherhood is only a middle chapter, and you could maybe argue that having a third game with Ezio was an even worse idea, but personally, I'm a proponent of in for a penny, in for a pound, you know what I mean? And Brotherhood marks a much neater point in the series' evolution than Revelations does. It's the start of the yearly releases, when Assassin's Creed transitioned from just a series of video games to Ubisoft's biggest cash cow. It's also the last Assassin's Creed game that series creative director Patrice Désilets worked on, taking a creative break from the industry midway through production and then later quitting Ubisoft entirely. From this point forward, the franchise is going to churn through creative directors pretty quickly. That marks Brotherhood as the first of many points where the Assassin's Creed franchise has died. Désilets and most of the creative team are gone by the end of this game. It's not their baby anymore. It's Ubisoft's. But all of this is stuff around the game and not really to do with the game itself, and none of this would matter if Brotherhood was bad, now would it? That's what makes Brotherhood such a critical point in the series. It represents the total corporate takeover of the series, taking the story and the concepts in directions that the original creators didn't intend, and permanently altering the course of the entire franchise. And the result was a fantastic and beloved game. Whoops. That's not how that's supposed to work. Corporate art is supposed to be bad. If you hate Ubisoft, which, trust me, you have plenty of perfectly valid reasons to hate Ubisoft, then the world would be so much easier if Brotherhood was a bad game, wouldn't it? If art only made in the interest of making large corporations more money was always bad. But unfortunately, reality isn't always as neat as we would like it to be. So, with all that said, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, a game that I kind of wish was bad, but unfortunately that I love.
I don't think anyone ever expects to wake up one morning and find themselves caught in the middle of a war between 2 secret organizations.
Well, you got me there, Des. I can't say I would expect that either. Like the previous game, Brotherhood starts with a recap, and already these recaps are getting a bit convoluted. But it is necessary because also like the previous game, Brotherhood starts immediately where the last game left off. Twice this time, as both Ezio and Desmond's stories pick up directly from where we last saw them. Well, actually Ezio starts with a glitchy fast forward to the end of the game, but primarily it picks up right where we left him standing under the Vatican fondling his magic ball. In many ways, the story of Brotherhood is pretty much the same as Assassin's Creed 2, particularly in the way it's structured. Just like Assassin's Creed 2, it starts with quiet domestic life. As far as Ezio is concerned, his quest for revenge is over. He's pretty much ready to retire, so the hood's down and he's just helping out around town. We get a quick little recap on Ezio's vibe. He's a flirt, he's noble, he's extremely competent, and he sleeps with all the ladies. And then, just like the last game, it all comes crashing down as the town is besieged by the Borgia, and kind Uncle Mario is executed by Cesare Borgia. So, there we go. Ezio's out for revenge. Again. This time it's even more personal. As far as set pieces go, the siege is the most cinematic the series has gotten so far. A lot of the action is obviously scripted, like the horse run through town, which is clearly only has one direction to go in. But the visuals are excellent, especially seeing the approaching army from the battlements and just knowing that no matter how many you take down, there's simply no way to get them all. Considering there's only a year between 2 and Brotherhood, the leap in graphical quality is kind of shocking. And again, this is the 2016 remaster, but even then, the amount of characters and assets the game can portray in the siege is clearly just the programmers showing off their fancy engine advances more than anything else. The siege is also how the game resets Ezio back to level 0, as the horse sequence also gives time for the Animus to tell you all the things you've just lost from the previous game and will have to slowly work your way back up to again. But before we can start that, it's time for Desmond to finally make his appearance. Desmond and the crew pull up at their new safe house, and it's awfully familiar, Monteriggioni, the place you just left. It's the first time the franchise has actually shown a location as it exists in 2 different time periods. Modern Monteriggioni hasn't changed all that much in the last 500 years, the streetlights are electric now and there's cars parked around town instead of horses, but the feeling of walking around it is incredibly nostalgic, much more than it would be if you were walking around as Ezio. Desmond now has the option to leave the Animus whenever he wants, and you can run around the town on a strict time limit as to not get caught by Abstergo's watchful eye. There's a few very minor collectibles to find out there, mementos from Assassin's Creed 2, like the box that Ezio stored all those feathers in, but primarily the reason to do it is just to soak in the vibes. And overall, the vibes for Desmond's story this time around is Tomb Raider. Desmond and Co set up in the sanctuary underneath the villa where Ezio grabbed that fancy armour in the last game. And like the first game, they're once again on the hunt for an Apple of Eden, which they hope will help them prevent this sun apocalypse business. The difference is that instead of raiding tombs looking for treasure, you're raiding the memories of someone who already raided those tombs 500 years ago. Although Desmond does get a couple of his own, including a flirty adventure through the escape tunnels with Lucy. There's a quiet domesticity to the modern day segments of Brotherhood. There are no enemies to fight this time around. Abstergo doesn't find you this time. Everyone's just doing their jobs, bonding, getting into petty squabbles. You can read everyone's emails, and primarily they're just really domestic things like arguing over who's doing the lunch run today. It's maybe not the most dramatic use of the modern day in the series, but it is by far the coziest of them all. Chilling in Italy with your friends looking for some ancient treasure, with only the small caveat that Desmond is slowly losing his mind. The bleeding effect is by far the most interesting story idea in the modern day sections, and unfortunately it's also the one that they do the least with. It's what allowed Desmond to pick up Ezio's skills, sure, but it's also bleeding more than just skills. He's starting to lose his perspective on time itself, shown by the ghosts he sees of people escaping the villa as he traverses the tunnels 500 years later. This also happened halfway through Assassin's Creed 2, when Desmond completely slips into a memory of Altair without even being in the Animus. But actually seeing the 2 eras blend over the same location makes it feel much more relevant to the story as it happens. Even in minor conversations, Desmond constantly says I did something instead of Ezio did something and has to correct himself. Through this creeping bleed of past and present, you can start to understand why Desmond's predecessor started writing all those symbols on the wall in his own blood. But none of this really comes to anything in this game. It's set up for later in the ongoing Assassin's Creed story that unfortunately gets resolved before it ever really becomes a major problem. A certain kind of Assassin's Creed fan likes to talk about the grand story plan of the original games, which Ubisoft has completely destroyed and failed to follow up on. But personally, I think that's giving Desolé and the gang a little bit too much credit, especially considering that Brotherhood wasn't part of that original plan in the first place. Originally, Assassin's Creed was supposed to be a trilogy, and also if you actually read what they've said about the original plans for how the series was supposed to go, it sounds kind of bonkers and terrible anyway. As you get further into the Desmond saga, the making it up as we go along feeling starts to get more and more obvious, and dropped ideas like the bleeding effect contribute a lot to that feeling, as well as the game's big twist ending, but we'll save that discussion for later.
My name is Desmond Miles, and this is my story.
Oh, you keep telling yourself that, buddy. The true meat of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is, of course, Ezio's, and while the setup of the story is identical to Assassin's Creed 2, the structure of the game is quite different. More different than I think people really give it credit for. While all of the games are considered open-world games, Brotherhood presents a much more open world than the previous games did. Instead of the multiple cities of the previous games, Brotherhood only has one super big one, the city of Rome. It is by far the biggest map in the series up to this point, and yet initially this singular focus can make the game feel smaller than its predecessors, because you don't quite get the same variation that you do in the first two games, switching between locations as the story goes along. And true to history, Rome isn't quite as tall and built up as the streets of Venice were in the last game. What Rome does have, though, that none of the other locations have had, is layers. Rome doesn't have as much verticality in its city streets, but it does have verticality in the more natural way, with cliffs and hills and stairways between them. But that's only the most obvious layering. Rome has layers of class, with the extremely wealthy and baroque Vatican district to the crumbling outskirts where all the peasants live. But most importantly, Rome exists in layers of history. Rome is a much, much older city than Florence or Venice. While Ezio's time feels like ancient history to us, the history of Rome goes 3 times that much again to an even older time of emperors and gladiators, and Brotherhood puts that even older history on full display. It fudges history a little bit to make that happen, exposing ruins that wouldn't actually be dug up for another 400 years, but fine, the ruins are in the right place, they're just dug up early. The effect is similar to the bleeding effect in the modern day, houses that people are currently living in right next to 1500-year-old ruins of a lost empire. Rome is a place that's often explored in pop culture, but not this Rome. The Rome we usually see is Rome at its height, during the time of the Roman Empire, in and around the year 0. Renaissance Rome doesn't have such a pop culture vision. All of this to say, Brotherhood's Rome is one of my favourite open worlds of the entire series. It feels a little quaint in comparison to the scale of the modern games, but its tight focus and layers of history leave such a complete impression that I just can't believe that it was made in a single year. It seems impossible. And it's not just the level design that makes me love Rome so much, it's everything they put into it as well. Brotherhood isn't just a more open world because it's bigger. The entire story is structured in a much more freeform way. Assassin's Creed 2 had very distinct main activities and side activities, where the entire structure of Brotherhood is built to make that distinction much more blurry. Some of the best and most bombastic moments in Brotherhood are technically side activities, but there's an understanding that everything you do in Brotherhood is meaningful and contributing to the overall experience. Brotherhood is about the liberation of Rome from the cruel occupation of the Borgia, and everything you do, no matter how minor, is contributing to that overall goal. And through that, every side activity, no matter how minor, feels more meaningful. Side activities in Assassin's Creed 2 are just that, side activities. They do not matter at all. Deliver these letters because someone asked you to. Assassinate this guy because it's something to do. Brotherhood gives these side activities narrative focus. You're not just delivering a letter to be nice, you're helping the courtesans root out a corrupt politician, or helping the thieves take out a rival gang funded by the Borgia. The war against the Borgia is a war fought on many fronts. Those are just the most minor side activities, the faction quests, and they're just one of many that escalate in depth and engagement. There's also the layers of Romulus, this game's version of the tombs, exploring the spooky underground ruins and secret societies of Rome. The most insane missions in the game were the Da Vinci war machines, where you take a trip out of Rome to use and then destroy one of Da Vinci's creations, which shockingly are all actually based on Da Vinci's real life sketches. Brotherhood just takes the leap that Da Vinci actually managed to make them. The bleeding effect even comes into play with some of these side missions too. As you complete more of the game, you'll unlock what the game calls repressed memories, which is a concept I'm absolutely shocked they haven't done more with across these games. These are short flashbacks to the events of the second game involving times that Ezio met up with his former girlfriend Christina, eventually revealing that she died during the Bonfire of the Vanities, having never reconciled their relationship. It's a side story completely separate from what the rest of the game has going on, and it does some good for Ezio, showing that while he's still the same ladies' man he's always been, he doesn't quite feel love in the same way he once did, something that will become much more relevant in the next game. The ideal rhythm of play in Brotherhood is one of distraction. While you may be running towards the next main story mission, you're supposed to take detours along the way with some of these side missions. The story of Brotherhood is technically shorter than Assassin's Creed 2, only 9 sequences to 2's 12, but with the massively expanded side content, your overall time investment in the game is much the same. Getting distracted was always part of the rhythm of Assassin's Creed, particularly the impulse to climb towers and get those viewpoints. Brotherhood just takes that impulse and magnifies it to make it more rewarding. Not only are there viewpoints, there are special Borgia towers that serve as outposts where you need to take down the captain and then burn the tower down in a dramatic display that frees the local population from control, and allows you to engage with Ezio's favourite hobby, home renovation. Every shop in the game, along with a handful of faction buildings, fast travel access tunnels, aqueducts, and eventually those ancient monuments themselves, can be bought and renovated to start earning you a passive income. It's not really something you're supposed to focus on, but rather another thing to do while on your way between various different locations. It's actually a delightfully complicated little system. It's similar to the villa renovations in the last game, but because it doesn't require constant backtracking, it feels much less intrusive, and you might not even realise that it's a completely isolated system for the most part. After a while, you're only making more money in order to renovate more buildings. But seeing the shop go from a shuttered abandoned wreck to a bustling place of commerce really makes you feel like you're making a difference. It has just as much narrative weight as the main story because you're making a tangible impact on the world. You're bringing it back to life. It's exactly the same feeling you get from something like Power Wash Simulator, actually. It's cozy game design. Money is the reward, but money isn't truly the motive to do it. The motive is just to see the town rebuilt again. The monuments aren't even a part of the system, really. They're just a money thing for when you've got nothing else left to buy. They cost loads and don't really make you all that much in comparison, but that's because by the time you can easily afford to buy them, you probably don't actually need the money anymore anyway. Brotherhood's economy is, from a top-down perspective, completely borked. Money is never an issue or a challenge, because that's not what the system is for. The system is just a framework for the cozy world that Brotherhood wants to put you in. A common complaint of Assassin's Creed 2, and one that I talked about extensively, was the game's complete lack of difficulty when it comes to the combat. When you get complaints like that, you might expect that the next game will do something about it, and I guess technically they did, except what they did was make the combat even easier, which I didn't think was possible, but by golly they managed it. This is thanks to 3 new systems that do their best to completely trivialise the combat entirely. The first is the chain kill system. Now, when you manage to kill someone, if you hit the attack button again at the right time, you will immediately chain to the next enemy and kill them in a single hit. And you can keep doing this for the entire fight as long as you don't get hit or mess up the timing, both of which are easy to pull off because the timing is so generous. On its own, the chain kill system breaks combat, but there's still 2 other systems. The expansion of ranged combat with the crossbow. We finally got there, you guys, we got the crossbow! And the assassin recruits if you just don't feel like doing any work at all. Once you get enough recruits, you can just hit the instant win button and have all your followers kill everyone around you in one go. It's probably fair to say that Brotherhood is the easiest game in the entire series thanks to these 3 systems working in tandem. Even with all your gear removed at the beginning, Ezio is an unstoppable force of nature. You are comically overpowered even from the beginning of the game. And I'm not saying any of this is an insult, I think it's great. Brotherhood fully leans into the ideas that were started in the second game when it comes to challenge and friction in video games. Brotherhood only conceptualizes difficulty as a self-imposed choice. You don't have to use all the tools it gives you, but if you do, you can pretty much trivialize any part of the game that you want to, including the stealth. Which, thanks to the crossbow and your recruits, feels much more viable than it did in the last game. This is all fine because thematically it's in line with what's going on in the story. Ezio is no longer the rookie he was in the last game. He's got his 20 years of experience, and now he's at the peak of his power and ability. Ezio's story in Brotherhood is about revenge, sure, but it's also about him becoming the leader of the assassins as a whole, building up a brotherhood of his own. Brotherhood doesn't want you to feel challenged, it wants you to feel like a hero. You're the boss, and your example inspires others to follow you. It's a power fantasy in the truest sense of the word, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you're looking for a challenge, the game does provide them. First of all, there's a big list of VR challenges to aim for, but more importantly, each mission in the game now comes with a bonus objective for full synchronization. These are totally optional, but provide an extra challenge to those looking for it. They can be to kill someone in a certain way, or not kill anyone, or not get caught, or kill as many people as you can. They vary from mission to mission and provide an extra incentive to replay missions if you're a completionist, but only if you want them, because the game isn't really about that challenge. It's about gunning down soldiers with a Renaissance machine gun. It's about watching like a proud dad as your recruits take down a target for you. It's about freedom. And if you don't want freedom and you don't want to be a hero, the game even provided that experience too. A staple of the franchise from this point forward is gimmicks. Every game needs a gimmick, something that sets it apart from the rest of the series mechanically as well as its setting. Brotherhood's gimmick, however, actually started this practice pretty strongly with a gimmick that stuck around for a good few years. An entirely separate multiplayer mode. The early 2010s was the era of the tacked-on multiplayer mode. Mass Effect got one, Red Faction got one, and Assassin's Creed got one. And it got what I consider to be the very best tacked-on multiplayer mode we've ever gotten. Unfortunately, the server shut down a few years ago, rendering the entire thing completely lost to history, which makes my game archivist heart very, very sad. The only one left is Assassin's Creed 4, so that's the footage I'm going to have to use, which is ultimately not a huge deal because, well, the time period is obviously different and there are a few minor gameplay tweaks. The concept is the same. And conceptually, it's absolutely genius. It's a game of cat and mouse where you are both cat and mouse at the same time. There was no combat at all, it's all about stealth. You're given one other player to kill, and also someone, or maybe several people, are trying to kill you. So you need to blend in and stay hidden from the people hunting you while sniffing out the person you're hunting, receiving more points the stealthier your kill is. It actually engages with the social stealth ideas the games are going for in a much better and more mechanically interesting way than the base games ever manage. The whole thing is framed as a training simulation for hysterical agents, so the map is populated by other NPCs that look identical to your and the other players' characters. The only way to tell a player from an NPC is by hunting for behaviour that goes against what the NPCs are supposed to do, like running or moving in strange patterns. Where in the single player, running from point A to point B is a lot of what you do, running is only a last resort in multiplayer because as soon as you start running, you're exposing yourself to everyone around you. Stealth is so much more important when the person hunting you has an actual thinking human brain. It's a type of multiplayer that's kind of antithetical to all other player versus player experiences, which are usually all about just having a straight up fight. If you're going for a straight up fight in Assassin's Creed, you're going to lose, even if you kill all your targets, because you're not playing the game as intended. I have no idea why they stopped supporting this mode, but we haven't had a new version of it in over 10 years, so I can assume that the player base wasn't big enough to justify the development cost of supporting it on every game, which is very, very sad because I loved it. Some people will argue that the Assassin's Creed series is single-player first and that's what they should focus on, and for the vast majority of tacked-on multiplayer modes I agree completely. But with Assassin's Creed multiplayer they had something special in their hands that I don't think should have been thrown away so easily. The only trace left now of the multiplayer is some weirdly over-designed assassination targets in the main campaign, including the first woman you ever kill in the games, and that's certainly a trivia fact for you. I've not talked about the actual story of Brotherhood too much so far, and that's because, really more than any other game in the series, the story of Brotherhood doesn't matter. The setup matters because taking down the Borgia is the framework that all the game's systems are built around, but the main story itself is pretty basic. Cesare Borgia is a simple villain. He's arrogant, bitter, hateful, and incestuous. He's just a bad guy, and all of his followers are snivelling powermongers exploiting the city for their own personal gain. The Borgia are a problem that needs to be solved. The game does have some philosophy to explore, more than the last game did anyway, but it's not about if these men should die or not, it's about the best way to go about killing them. Machiavelli is back with a much bigger role than he had in the last game, as he serves as something of an ideological sparring partner for Ezio, and it all comes down to the value of the people. Machiavelli is a results-driven kind of guy. Go in, murder the Borgia, no excuses. They're making the world worse, they need to die. Ezio believes that real change can't just be achieved that way, that in order to secure meaningful change you need the support of the common people.
I intend to heal the sickness, not treat its symptoms.
Stop sparring with me.
Fine, let us talk openly then. Rodrigo Borgia's death would not have solved anything.
I am inclined to disagree.
Look at this city, the center of Borgia and Templar rule. Killing one man will not change things. We need to take away the source of their power.
Are you suggesting we appeal to the people?
Maybe.
Relying on the people is like building on the sand.
You are wrong. Our belief in humanity rests at the heart of the Assassin Brotherhood.
He must be from your inner circle. Go, get back what he has stolen.
A return to philosophy is more than welcome, especially when one of your main characters is Niccolo Machiavelli, one of the most controversial political theorists in history. Machiavelli is most famous for a book called The Prince, a guide for would-be rulers or princes on how to gain and maintain power. You've probably at least heard the most famous line at least once before. It's better to be feared than loved. While that's actually cutting the quote short, that is Machiavelli's reputation. The book is incredibly cynical about power and how to maintain it. As part of its guide, it advocates trusting no one, using morality only when it's in your best interest, and, yes, political assassination. To this day, Machiavellian refers to a person or a character who's completely cutthroat and ruthlessly intelligent when it comes to gaining and maintaining power. It might seem weird then that he's one of the good guys, but that's confusing the man with his writings. While the book is framed as a guide, Machiavelli didn't intend it exclusively to be used by would-be princes. The book is more like a textbook. It exposes to everyone how tyrants gain and maintain power, and if you read between the lines, how to exploit their weaknesses as well. Machiavelli was a Republican at heart, and by that I mean he favoured a governmental system based on democratic values, not that he wears the silly hat. The Prince actually uses the rise and fall of Cesare Borgia as an example of how to gain and maintain power effectively, and he praises Cesare for his shrewdness and intellect, not in an improving or disapproving way, but just in a factual way. With that in mind, Machiavelli actually slots perfectly in with the Assassins. There's a lot of crossover between Machiavellian politics and the Assassin's maxim, nothing is true, everything is permitted. Which you'll recall isn't so much a statement of intention as it is a warning about the true nature of the world, just as the Prince is about the true nature of power. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood effectively makes itself a prequel to The Prince. It shows how Ezio influenced Machiavelli's views and perspective on the world through his total belief in the power of the people. Machiavelli's little jab about relying on the people being like building on sand is actually a reference to The Prince, where Machiavelli tells readers to dismiss that idea and to never underestimate the people. And do not let anyone impugn this statement with the trite proverb that he who builds on the people builds on the sand. For this is true when a private citizen makes a foundation there and persuades himself that the people will free him for when he is oppressed by his enemies or by the magistrates, wherein he would find himself very often deceived. But granted a prince who has established himself as above, who can command, and is a man of courage, undismayed by adversity, who does not fail in other qualifications, and who, by his resolution and energy, keeps the whole people encouraged, such a one will never find himself deceived in them, and it will be shown that he has laid his foundations well.
I intend to write a book about you one day.
If you do, make it short.
Within Assassin's Creed Brotherhood are two princes, Ezio and Cesare, and through contrasting examples the game makes its case for the best pathway to gain and maintain power. You're doing it the whole game, be it renovating shops or assassinating corrupt officials. Because what Machiavelli said isn't actually that it's better to be feared than loved. What he said was, it's safer to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. Love and fear are both tools of a potential prince. In order to maintain power over a long period of time, you need to be loved by your allies and feared by your enemies. If you can only pick one, then pick fear, because people who are scared of you are less likely to attack you than people who love you, because, and I quote, "Love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails." No one ever accused the man of being an optimist. Cesare chooses fear, Ezio chooses both, and in doing so he builds a stronger foundation, especially because there's actually a third part to Machiavelli's view on love and fear, that if one chooses to rule through fear, they must do so in a way that avoids becoming hated, because while fear wards off attacks, Hatred inspires them. While mechanically the game is as cozy as ever, within the story the game is willing to explore some slightly darker sides of history, particularly around the treatment of women, with references this time to slavery and other words that will get me demonetized. This isn't done in an exploitative way as much as it's another way the game contrasts Ezio and Cesare's philosophy. Ezio and the assassins do not discriminate. The game starts with Ezio being an overprotective brother to his now 37-year-old sister, but eventually he sees that she's more than capable of taking care of herself, and he accepts her, and ultimately she ends up joining the Brotherhood as an assassin herself. Along with that, the assassins you can recruit from the citizens of Rome are both men and women. As long as they're willing to fight, the assassins don't care where they came from. In contrast, the main interaction Cesare has is with his own sister, whom he views as both useless and as a trophy. And, yes, incest is involved. There is a reason the Borgia have their own Game of Thrones knockoff show. They were very messy. Within the assassins, Claudia can make herself an equal and appear with Ezio and the men, but Lucrezia is doomed to always be a political pawn and a princess in a tower. And in doing that, Cesare inadvertently shuts off one of his most cunning and powerful allies without even realising it. Another way the game explores that darker side of history is through Caterina Sforza. During the initial assault on Monteriggione, she's captured by the Borgia, and Ezio mounts a daring rescue mission to save her, which goes off without a hitch. True to history, after being freed, she rides off to Florence to start conspiring to take back her home, and that's the last we see of her, riding off into the night, shouting "Vittoria agli assassini!" A conversation with Sean back in the real world illustrates her final fate. She died of pneumonia 6 years later and never recovered her home. The games always make a narrative out of history, but reality is never that nice. Most people's lives don't actually fit that well into a satisfying story arc. Sometimes all that build-up doesn't amount to anything but dying from the plague. That's actually how most stories end throughout history. It's also how Rodrigo Borgia historically died. Nothing quite ruins a good narrative like catching a cold in an age before medicine and regular hand washing. Far from ruining the cozy atmosphere, these darker, more realistic touches make the entire world of Brotherhood feel more vivid. A fight against the Borgia feels more important when the cruelties feel more real than them just being big bullies. Although just like the last game, things get more daring within Subject 16th's truths, which in this game are both more vague and more focused. Where the last game spread its truths throughout human history, Brotherhood focuses specifically on the modern day, implicating the Bush administration and even a real, living and currently serving Supreme Justice and suggesting that he's a secret Templar. I find it particularly funny when people talk about how the modern games have gone political, because there is no way in hell Ubisoft would allow something this inflammatory to get through the net today. The game explicitly states that capitalism is just a tool used by corporations to keep the poor from rising up and stops just short of supporting armed revolution against the government for their corruption. It's not pulling any punches. In an old interview, lead writer Jeffrey Yolem even talked about how he felt it was necessary to talk about modern politics, literally bragging about injecting politics into his video games. But I guess explicitly condemning the warmongering actions of Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush isn't as political as having a black samurai. Considering the modern climate of AAA games, seeing a game be this explicit with its politics is absolutely jarring. Far Cry 6 is out there like, corrupt dictators are bad, we think. Meanwhile, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood was like, listen up motherfuckers, TV and Hollywood are a tool of the global elite to keep the proletariat docile so as to prevent a revolution against them. The irony, of course, being that Ubisoft itself is obviously a part of that global machine, something which they even start getting meta about in the later games. Such is the fun of entertainment made under capitalism. Unfortunately, the final truth isn't a big world-shattering revelation like Adam and Eve in the last game. Instead, it's just extremely cryptic nonsense. 16 himself appears before Desmond and mentions some vague stuff about finding the sixth, finding Eve and not trusting her, and something about Desmond's son. A huge pile of foreshadowing that, having played all of Desmond's games, I'm not sure is in reference to anything that actually happens later, aside from maybe the not trusting her referring to Juno or maybe to someone else who we'll get to shortly. This is the kind of storytelling that I hate the most, a whole bunch of cryptic vagaries with no concrete answers. It's possible that all of this was supposed to lead somewhere and Ubisoft changed the plan, but that's easy to say and impossible to prove, because it's not what ended up happening. And the end of the game itself is all about that too. Desmond and crew are eventually able to piece together that Ezio hid the apple in the chamber under the Colosseum in Rome, and so as the last act of the game, the crew all drive over there and do some tomb raiding of their own. As you make your way through the tomb, another ghost of one who came before starts talking to you. And she doesn't seem quite as friendly as Minerva was. This is Juno, and apparently only Desmond can see or hear her. She keeps saying very ominous things about how humanity was built for servitude, but Desmond seems to pay no mind and beeline straight for the apple. At which point, Juno takes control of his body and forces him to stab Lucy with his hidden blade. And then, as we've come to expect, the credits roll. This is certainly the most dramatic cliffhanger of the Desmond saga, but also the most confusing. It's hinted at in the scene, and then later explained, sort of, in Revelations, that Lucy was actually a triple agent. She was an assassin who was corrupted by the Templars, who's now posing as an assassin again. And that is just so convoluted and ultimately doesn't really make any sense when you look at her actions in the previous 2.5 games. And that's because it was never the plan in the first place. In fact, according to Desolé, the decision to kill off Lucy here was his own, and the reasons are just so Ubisoft. The source on this is an interview Desolé gave a few years ago, and it's in French, so I'm relying on a translation here. But apparently, Kristen Bell, who plays Lucy and who you might recognise as, well, a famous person, was contracted for 3 games, and to extend her contract she also asked for residuals on the game. Ubisoft didn't want to do that, and so Desolé killed her off without even telling her it was going to happen. Charming stuff. Sure, it makes for an exciting cliffhanger ending, but it does so at the cost of breaking a huge part of the modern day story. And the fact that Desolé happily claims credit for it really shows me that he wasn't super married to his original plans of Desmond and Lucy ending up in love in a spaceship either. Ultimately, it doesn't matter too much because, as I think I've made pretty clear, the modern day stuff is so completely inconsequential to what the actual appeal of the games is. But still, I think it's a pretty clear example that even if there was some sort of overarching plan for the story, no one on the team was invested enough in it to give Kristen Bell slightly more money. She was about to be in Frozen, you guys. You need her more than she needs you. Being that it's a middle chapter, Ezio doesn't get a particularly final feeling climax either. He manages to hunt down Cesare and seals away the apple for Desmond to find it 500 years later. However, the game does have an epilogue unlike the previous 2 games. It's just that that epilogue costs extra. Brotherhood actually has 2 significant story expansions, but only one of them is really relevant. The first one is called The Copernicus Conspiracy, which you've probably figured out centres around Nicholas Copernicus. It was a Day 1 DLC mission pack exclusive to the PS3 release of the game, although now with the Ezio collection I can actually play it, and I can safely say I wasn't missing too much. It's fine, it's a mission pack. Copernicus, if you don't know, was the first scholar to posit that the Earth rotates around the Sun rather than the Sun around the Earth, and the story's about the Church, but more specifically the Templars, trying to suppress that truth because it goes against the current teachings of the Church. It's fine. I'm not that upset that I didn't get to play it for 6 years. The main DLC expansion for the game is an extra sequence on top of the main story called the Vinci Disappearance, which serves as a much more satisfying epilogue to the story of Brotherhood than Desmond stabbing Lucy because Desolé doesn't want to pay her anymore. It technically takes place before the end of the game as Ezio returns to Rome to find a ship that will take him to Spain for his final confrontation with Cesare, but that matters little because what it feels like is a fond goodbye to Rome and all the people you've met in it. The setup, as you've probably figured out, is that Leonardo da Vinci has disappeared, and Ezio has to work together with Leonardo's boy toy Sly to find him. That's not a joke, that's literally what he is, and the game paints it in a shockingly nonchalant way, even though even by today's standards their relationship is a little bit risky. Not because they're gay, but because of the age difference. They first met when Leonardo was in his 30s and Sly was 10. The game chooses to gloss over that detail and paint them as just kind of conventionally in love, which for what it's worth Ezio has no issues with. And considering the last 2 games have made a very concerted effort to paint Da Vinci as the most precious cinnamon roll you ever did see, I can understand why they might want to just avoid the creepy angles of this relationship entirely. The fact that they included it at all is at least worth a nod of approval.
I suppose Salai is out having fun spending my hard-earned florins.
He is safe at home.
I am relieved. About the florins, of course.
You do not need to lie to me. Salai fits you. I approve.
I am...
Leonardo da Vinci at a loss for words. That is a first.
And Sly is a fun character on his own, especially in his interactions with Ezio, because it's sort of like Ezio having to deal with a younger, gayer version of himself. Leonardo left clues to his whereabouts hidden in some of his paintings, a kind of Da Vinci Code, if you will, but the paintings are scattered around Rome, and each mission to find them serves as a bit of a where are they now for some of the key players in the base game. The first is with Lucrezia Borgia, now remarried for political reasons and hating life, but notably still alive. One is in the hands of Duccio, Duccio, that one guy from Assassin's Creed 2 who was engaged to Claudia. Yeah, he's back, and he has one of the most weirdly elaborate boss fights in the game as Ezio beats him up for the honour of his sister a second time. And then a couple are on display in a gallery that only Claudia and her girls can help you get into. It's a farewell tour for the game, and also for the story as well, because while technically within the story Ezio is sailing for Spain next, really we know that he's sailing to Constantinople next for the final chapter of his story. And if you just kind of pretend that's the subtext of the DLC, it works pretty well. Probably should have been a part of the main story, but that's just that Ubisoft sparkle of magic, isn't it? Technically, there's a whole plot about Da Vinci being kidnapped by the cult of Hermes who are looking for the numbers that'll rewrite reality or whatever, but that's not really what the DLC is about. The DLC is about having one last adventure with your old friend Da Vinci for his last appearance in the series, at least until that VR game that I think he shows up in. A quiet ending, doing some climbing puzzles with your old friend makes so much more sense for Brotherhood than a flashy, dramatic ending, because it's just not a flashy and dramatic sort of game. Even in the most intense action moments, the vibe is laid back, and so the ending should be laid back too. The numbers do mean something, although not what the cultists had imagined. They're coordinates to the temple that Assassin's Creed 3 is centred around, because apparently they shoved old Dez right back into the Animus after stabbing his girlfriend in order to dig out those coordinates. But hey, that part gets cut off because the modern Xbox load times are too fast. What's important is that Ezio says goodbye to his oldest friend and sets sail for new horizons, which we'll of course get to pretty soon thanks to that endless yearly churn, but we'll talk more about that later. A lot of critics will point to the yearly releases as a sign that the franchise is cheap and rushed. How can you possibly make a full game in only a year? Well, you do it by being one of the biggest publishers in the industry. From Assassin's Creed 2 onwards, the series is made by global teams numbering in the thousands or thereabouts. The games absolutely have the production line development standard, and there's always multiple projects in development at once. Ubisoft do not really approach their games from an art-forward perspective. They approach them as products. That doesn't mean they're not art, as some people might suggest. Artists are still the ones making all of this stuff, some of the most talented artists in the industry, and Ubisoft continually abuses them. I don't have any horror stories this time around, but since it's his last game, it's worth noting that Desley has never spoken with any particular fondness about his time at Ubisoft. He gave a pretty scathing interview a few years ago talking about how leading up these massive teams took a pretty hefty emotional and mental strain on him. And he seems much happier now making his weird missing link survival games or whatever the Humankind Odyssey is. I've never played it. Then again, he happily jokes about murdering Lucy for the money, so who knows? Machiavelli was right, you can't trust anyone. At least he finally got to ride a horsey around town. More than any other game in the series really does, Brotherhood forces me to confront the truth of Ubisoft and how I feel about them, because it's a game made for purely corporate interests that I happen to love. That's not very revolutionary of me now, is it? Not very countercultural? I'm giving up all my hippie cred if I ever had any. It's a game that warns you about the propaganda hidden within our entertainment that happens to be exactly that propagandistic entertainment. And that's just the sacrifice you make engaging in not only Ubisoft, but all mainstream entertainment. Fallout is an Amazon Prime show. So is The Boys. That's just the world we live in. Dissatisfaction with the system is just another market to be catered to. There are some people who consider it immoral to support Ubisoft given some of the things that have come out about them. And while I kind of agree with that in spirit, I've never been big on boycotts. I can't look at Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and shut out the hundreds of artists that poured their heart and soul into making it. And if that just sounds like making excuses, that's exactly what it is. I am making excuses to keep enjoying Assassin's Creed because, regardless of what anyone else says, I think they are art and they've been a part of my life for so long that I don't know how to cut them out. It's just a big mess that I would rather not think about. But I guess it's my job to think about it, isn't it? I'm still thinking about it. Come back later.
It is done. The way lies all before you. Only she remains to be found. Awaken the sixth. Go, alone!
You see what I did there? I ended the video on an unresolved cliffhanger. Oh, I bet you're invested to come back and see the next part now. And if you want to help me make that, then you can join these wonderful people up here as one of my patrons, who I am very thankful to every time for your support. I messed that one up at the end. But if you want to see your name up here or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me, as well as a like, a comment, a share, a subscribe, and a bell ringing. If you want to see the next part or all the previous parts, then you can find that in this playlist up here. Or for something different, check out this video about Chants of Sonar. It's very good. No one watched it, and that makes me upset. So don't make me upset and go watch this Chants of Sonar video.